The winter of 1872 blew through Cottonwood Springs, Colorado territory, with a vengeance that matched the cold emptiness in Abigail Sullivan's heart. 6 months a widow, she stood at her husband's grave on the windswept hill overlooking the settlement, her black mourning dress whipping around her ankles as she placed a sprig of dried wildflowers against the wooden cross. "I don't know how to live without you, Thomas," she whispered, her words carried away by the biting December wind. At 26, Abigail found herself alone with nothing but a modest house too large for just one person and dwindling funds that wouldn't last through spring. The walk back to town gave her time to ponder the suggestion her friend Martha had made yesterday at church. "That big house of yours could serve as a boarding house, Abby. The railroad's bringing new folks through every week, and the saloon rooms are hardly suitable for decent travelers." The idea had seemed preposterous yesterday. Today, with the reality of her situation sinking in like the cold through her worn boots, it seemed like the only sensible option. By the time she reached the main street, Abigail had made her decision. She would open her home to boarders, and perhaps in serving others, find purpose again. 3 weeks later, Abigail stood in her front parlor, surveying the changes. The house Thomas had built with dreams of filling it with children now contained 4 bedrooms ready for guests. She'd cleaned until her hands were raw, moved furniture until her back ached, and sewn fresh curtains until her eyes strained. A painted sign hung beside the door: "Sullivan Boarding House, clean rooms, honest rates." When the bell above the door jangled for the first time, Abigail smoothed her apron and pushed a strand of auburn hair back into her simple bun. "Good afternoon," she said, forcing confidence into her voice. "Welcome to Sullivan Boarding House." The man who stood before her seemed to fill the doorway. Tall and broad-shouldered, he removed his hat to reveal dark hair touched with silver at the temples. His clothes were trail-worn but of good quality, and dust coated his boots and the bottom of his long coat. "Afternoon, ma'am. Name's Lucas Irwin. I understand you have rooms available." His voice was deep with a slight Eastern accent that stood out in this western town. Something in his blue eyes caught Abigail's attention, a weariness that went beyond physical travel. She recognized it from her own mirror. "Yes, Mr. Irwin. I have several rooms available. Will you be staying long in Cottonwood Springs?" He hesitated before answering. "I'm not certain. I have business that might keep me here a while." "Well, I offer fair weekly rates," she said, leading him up the stairs to show him the available rooms. He chose the room at the back of the house, overlooking the small garden. As Abigail handed him the key, their fingers brushed, and for the first time since Thomas died, she felt a flicker of something other than grief, a warmth that startled her so much she nearly dropped the key. "Dinner is at 6 sharp, Mr. Irwin," she said, stepping back quickly. "We don't stand on ceremony here, but I do expect punctuality at meals." Lucas nodded, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "Yes, ma'am. I'll remember that." That evening, as Abigail served stew to her first boarder, she couldn't help but wonder what business had brought this quiet man to their small town. More importantly, she wondered why she cared. By February, the Sullivan boarding house had filled with 4 regular boarders. Besides Lucas, there was Mr. Peterson, the new schoolteacher, Mrs. Holloway, a widow visiting her daughter, and Mr. Griffith, a drummer who sold dry goods throughout the territory. The routine of running the boarding house gave Abigail structure she hadn't realized she needed. Each morning, she rose before dawn to start breakfast. Days were filled with cleaning, baking, and keeping the books. Yet despite the full house, she found her attention continually drawn to Lucas Irwin. He was unlike the other boarders. While they shared stories over meals, Lucas listened more than he spoke. He left early each morning, returning just before dinner, his expression giving nothing away about his activities. When he did speak, it was with a thoughtfulness that made everyone at the table lean in to listen. One evening after the other boarders had retired, Abigail found Lucas still at the dining table, staring into his coffee cup. "Is everything all right, Mr. Irwin?" she asked, gathering the last of the dishes. He looked up, seemingly startled from deep thoughts. "Yes, Mrs. Sullivan. Just reviewing some details." He gestured to papers spread before him. Curiosity got the better of her. "May I ask what kind of business brings you to Cottonwood Springs? You've been here nearly a month now." Lucas carefully folded the papers and tucked them into a leather portfolio. "I'm looking for someone, Mrs. Sullivan. Someone who disappeared about 3 years ago." A criminal? She asked, suddenly concerned about having a bounty hunter in her home. No, he said softly. Family. Before she could inquire further, he stood. Thank you for the coffee. Your boarding house has been a blessing after months on the road. As he headed for the stairs, Abigail called after him. Mr. Irwin? I hope you find who you're looking for. He paused, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't interpret. Thank you, Mrs. Sullivan. So do I. That night, Abigail lay awake wondering about Lucas Irwin's missing family member and why finding this person seemed to weigh so heavily on him. She told herself her interest was merely neighborly concern, but the flutter in her chest when their eyes met over the breakfast table suggested otherwise. The following Sunday after church, Abigail walked home alongside Martha, listening to her friend's latest gossip about the town's happenings. And Sheriff Wilson says there's been a man asking questions all around town about that mining accident 3 years back, Martha said. The one that killed those 5 men when the Silverton mine collapsed. Abigail stopped walking. What sort of questions? Details about who was there, who survived. Seems peculiar to dig up such a tragedy after all this time. A suspicion formed in Abigail's mind. This man, did the sheriff describe him? Martha nodded. Tall fellow with dark hair going silver at the temples. Eastern accent. Sheriff said he showed credentials from some investigator's office in Boston. The description matched Lucas perfectly. But why would a man from Boston be investigating a mining accident in Colorado territory? And why hadn't he mentioned this when she'd asked about his business? That evening, when Lucas returned to the boarding house, Abigail noticed him limping slightly. His right hand was scraped raw. What happened to you, Mr. Irwin? She asked, setting down the book she'd been reading. Took a fall out by the old Silverton mine, he admitted. The terrain is treacherous out there. The Silverton mine has been closed for years, she said carefully. Not much reason for anyone to go there now. Something flickered across his face, awareness that she knew more than she was letting on. Mrs. Sullivan, he began. The front door burst open as Mr. Peterson and Mr. Griffith returned from the saloon, their loud conversation filling the quiet parlor. The moment between Abigail and Lucas evaporated, but the questions remained. Later that night, Abigail heard Lucas's door open and his footsteps moving quietly down the stairs. Wrapping a shawl around her nightdress, she followed, staying in the shadows of the hallway as he entered her small office and lit a lamp. What she saw next made her blood run cold. Lucas was going through her desk drawers, examining papers before carefully replacing them. Looking for something, Mr. Irwin? She asked, stepping into the doorway. He straightened abruptly, guilt evident on his face. Mrs. Sullivan, I can explain. I certainly hope so, she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Because from where I'm standing, it appears my boarder is searching through my private papers in the middle of the night. Lucas ran a hand through his hair. I need to see any records related to the Silverton mine accident. I heard your late husband worked as the company's accountant. The mention of Thomas took her by surprise. He did, but what possible interest could those records have for a Boston investigator? Lucas's eyes widened. You've been making inquiries about me. And you've been making inquiries about a tragedy that affected this entire town, she countered. I think you owe me an explanation before you go rifling through my husband's papers. For a long moment, Lucas studied her face as if making a difficult decision. Finally, he gestured to the chairs by the small fireplace. You're right. Please, sit down, Mrs. Sullivan. It's a long story, and not a pleasant one. As the clock struck midnight, Abigail learned why Lucas Irwin had come to Cottonwood Springs, and why she had a feeling he might never leave. My brother Daniel came west in '69, Lucas began, his eyes fixed on his clasped hands. He was always restless, always searching for his fortune. He wrote regularly at first, telling us about his adventures, the characters he met. Abigail sat perfectly still, afraid that any movement might cause Lucas to close up again. His last letter mentioned taking a job at a promising silver mine in Colorado territory. After that, nothing. For 3 years, we heard nothing. Lucas looked up, his blue eyes haunted. My mother died last year, still waiting for word from her son. And you believe he was at the Silverton mine? Abigail asked softly. Lucas nodded. I've tracked his movements to Cottonwood Springs. The timing matches the accident. But there's something strange. The official list of the dead doesn't include anyone named Daniel Irwin. That doesn't necessarily mean— No, he interrupted. but 3 of the 5 victims were listed only by descriptions. Unknown miner, approximately 30. Unknown worker, tall build. The company buried them in unmarked graves because no one claimed the bodies. Abigail thought back to that terrible day. Thomas had come home ashen-faced, devastated by the loss of life. The entire town had mourned. Mr. Sullivan kept all the company records. Lucas continued. Payroll, employment contracts. If Daniel worked there, even briefly. Understanding dawned on Abigail. You need proof he was there. For your family. For myself, Lucas corrected gently. I need to know what happened to him. I promised my mother. Abigail rose and walked to a painting on the wall, a landscape Thomas had purchased during their brief honeymoon in Denver. She lifted it, revealing a small wall safe. Thomas believed in keeping orderly records, she said, turning the dial to the combination. Even after the mine closed, he couldn't bear to dispose of the books. Said those men deserved to be remembered properly. She removed a stack of ledgers and placed them on the desk. If your brother worked at Silverton, his name will be in these. You're welcome to look, but please, do it in the light of day. No more midnight investigations. Lucas's expression softened with gratitude. Thank you, Mrs. Sullivan. I apologize for my approach tonight. Grief sometimes leads us down questionable paths. I'm familiar with grief's detours, Mr. Irwin, she replied, thinking of her own journey since Thomas's passing. Now it's late. We can continue this tomorrow. As she turned to leave, Lucas called after her. Abigail. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and it stopped her in her tracks. Thank you for understanding. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and hurried back to her room. But sleep eluded her as she wondered what Lucas would find in Thomas's meticulous records, and why the thought of him finding closure and leaving Cottonwood Springs filled her with such inexplicable sadness. The next morning, Abigail rose early as usual, but found Lucas already at the kitchen table, the ledgers spread before him, a half-empty pot of coffee at his elbow. Did you sleep at all, Mr. Irwin? He looked up, dark circles under his eyes. A bit. I wanted to get through these before bothering you again. And? She asked, reaching for the coffee pot. Nothing yet. But I'm only through 1869. He rubbed his eyes. Your husband was extraordinarily thorough. Thomas believed numbers told stories if you knew how to read them, she said, a fond smile touching her lips. He used to say that behind every column of figures was a human tale. Lucas watched her for a moment. You loved him very much. It wasn't a question, but Abigail answered anyway. We had 8 good years together. Not enough, but I'm grateful for each one. An understanding passed between them, the shared experience of loss creating a bridge neither had expected. The moment broke when Mrs. Holloway entered the kitchen, complaining about a draft in her room. The day's routine took over, and it wasn't until after dinner that Abigail and Lucas found themselves alone again. I found something, he said quietly, leading her to the study. He pointed to an entry in the April 1870 ledger. D. Irving, hired April 3rd. Irving, not Irwin, Abigail noted. Daniel sometimes used our mother's maiden name when he was trying to. Lucas hesitated. Start fresh, she suggested. He nodded. The writing matches his, and the age is correct. Abigail examined the employment record. He was hired just 3 weeks before the accident. Yes. Lucas turned the page to show her the final payroll. There, crossed out with a single line, was the name D. Irving. In the margin, Thomas had written deceased. Accident April 27, 70. Lucas's hand trembled slightly as he traced the words. At least now I know. Abigail placed her hand on his shoulder, feeling the tension beneath her fingers. I'm sorry, Lucas. He covered her hand with his own, the warmth of his touch sending an unexpected shiver through her. Having certainty after years of wondering is its own kind of peace. They stood like that for a long moment, connected by touch and shared understanding. When Lucas finally spoke again, his voice was husky with emotion. I should make arrangements to have his body properly marked and move to our family plot back east. Abigail nodded, withdrawing her hand reluctantly. Of course, I can help you with the arrangements. As she turned to leave, Lucas said, Abigail, would you show me where they buried the miners from the accident? Tomorrow, she promised. After breakfast. That night, Abigail found herself standing before her own husband's grave, silently telling Thomas about the stranger who had come to town searching for his brother. For the first time, speaking to Thomas in her mind didn't bring the usual sharp pain, just a gentle ache and fond remembrance. She wondered what Thomas would think of her helping Lucas Irwin. What would he think of the way her heart quickened when Lucas said her name? "I'm not betraying you," she whispered to the silent grave. "But I think I might be ready to feel something again." The wind rustled through the sparse trees of the cemetery, and Abigail chose to take it as Thomas's blessing. The miners' cemetery lay on the eastern edge of town, a stark contrast to the well-tended church graveyard where Thomas and other prominent townspeople were buried. Here, simple wooden markers stood in uneven rows, many weathered beyond legibility. "The unmarked ones at the back are from the Silverton accident," Abigail explained as they picked their way through the neglected plots. Lucas stood before the 5 crude crosses, his hat held against his chest. "Which one is his?" Abigail shook her head. "There's no way to know. The company buried them together after the recovery." Anger flashed across Lucas's face. "They deserved better than this." "They did," she agreed softly. Thomas argued with the mine owners about it, but in the end, he could only ensure they received a proper burial, even if unmarked. Lucas knelt in the dried grass, placing a hand on the soil before the crosses. "I'll have proper stones made for all of them," he decided. "If the others are unknown, at least their humanity should be acknowledged." As he stood, Abigail noticed tears in his eyes that he quickly blinked away. She pretended not to see, giving him a moment to compose himself. "There's something else you should know," she said finally. "Something that wasn't in the ledgers." Lucas turned to her, wary. "What is it?" After the accident, there were rumors. Whispers that it wasn't just poor mining practices that caused the collapse. She hesitated, uncertain whether she should continue. "Tell me," he urged. "Some said there were signs of deliberate damage to the support beams." Thomas investigated the company's finances afterward and found irregularities, missing funds, falsified safety reports. Lucas's expression hardened. "You're saying the accident might have been intentional?" Thomas believed someone was skimming profits and cut corners on safety to cover the theft. When inspectors were scheduled to visit, someone may have decided it was better to have an accident than face scrutiny. Did the sheriff investigate? Abigail's bitter laugh told him everything. Sheriff Wilson? His brother-in-law was one of the mine owners. The case was closed as a tragic accident within days. Lucas's hands clenched into fists. And the mine owners? What happened to them? Jasper Miller and Edward Dawson. They sold their remaining interests in the territory and left town about a year after the accident. Last I heard, Miller was in San Francisco, and Dawson had gone back east somewhere. A dangerous look crossed Lucas's face. Boston. Edward Dawson moved to Boston 2 years ago. He's made quite a name for himself in investment circles. The realization struck them both simultaneously. Lucas had been tracking his brother's movements without knowing he was potentially crossing paths with the man responsible for Daniel's death. "What will you do?" Abigail asked, suddenly afraid of the answer. Lucas stared at the unmarked graves for a long moment. "I came for truth and closure. Now I need justice too." As they walked back toward town, Abigail wondered if the man beside her would become something she'd never anticipated. Not just a permanent boarder, but an avenging angel bringing long-overdue reckoning to Cottonwood Springs. Over the following weeks, Lucas delved deeper into the Silverton mine tragedy. Using Thomas's records as a starting point, he interviewed former miners, company clerks, and townspeople who remembered the accident. Each conversation revealed new threads in a complex tapestry of corruption and negligence. Abigail found herself drawn into his investigation. Evenings at the boarding house now often ended with the two of them sitting in her small office, connecting pieces of evidence and theories while the other boarders retired for the night. Thomas suspected Miller and Dawson were siphoning investment funds. Abigail explained one evening, pointing to discrepancies in the financial ledgers. He was preparing to take his findings to the territorial authorities when the accident happened. Convenient timing, Lucas noted grimly. After the accident, Thomas was asked to settle the company's affairs locally. That's when he found these discrepancies, but by then, Miller and Dawson had protected themselves legally. The company declared bankruptcy, the investors lost everything, and those responsible walked away wealthy men. Lucas studied her face in the lamplight. "This matters to you personally, not just because of my brother." Abigail nodded slowly. Thomas never forgave himself for not discovering the fraud sooner. He believed he might have prevented the accident. She looked down at her hands. The guilt consumed him. His heart gave out last summer, but truthfully, it had been failing since that day in 1870. Lucas reached across the desk and took her hand. You believe the truth might bring him peace as well. Perhaps it might bring us all peace, she whispered. Their eyes met across the desk, and something shifted between them, a recognition that their separate quests for closure had become a shared mission. The moment was interrupted by a knock at the front door. Abigail frowned. It's nearly 9 o'clock. When she opened the door, Sheriff Wilson stood on her porch, his expression grim. Evening, Mrs. Sullivan. I need to speak with your boarder, Mr. Irwin. Lucas appeared behind her. What can I do for you, Sheriff? I've been receiving complaints about you asking questions around town, stirring up old troubles best left buried. The sheriff's hand rested meaningfully on his holstered gun. Some folks are saying you're making accusations against respected businessmen. I'm gathering information about my brother's death, Lucas replied evenly. If that makes certain people uncomfortable, perhaps they have reasons to be. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. This is a peaceful town, Mr. Irwin. We don't take kindly to outsiders bringing trouble. Funny, Lucas said, his voice deceptively calm. I thought lawmen were supposed to welcome the pursuit of justice, not obstruct it. Sheriff Wilson's face darkened. That sounds dangerously close to questioning my authority, mister. Not at all. Lucas smiled without warmth. Just making an observation. Abigail stepped between them, sensing the dangerous undercurrents. It's getting late, Sheriff. Perhaps whatever concerns you have could be addressed in the morning at your office. After a tense moment, the sheriff nodded curtly. Tomorrow, 10 o'clock, Mr. Irwin. Don't make me come looking for you. He tipped his hat to Abigail. Mrs. Sullivan. As the sheriff's footsteps faded down the walkway, Abigail turned to Lucas with concern. You've made an enemy. I've made several, it seems, Lucas replied, watching the sheriff's retreating figure. The question is, who complained to him, and why now? That night, Abigail lay awake worrying about Lucas's meeting with the sheriff. Despite her exhaustion, sleep evaded her. Around midnight, she heard soft footsteps in the hallway and recognized Lucas's distinctive tread. Wrapping her robe around herself, she stepped into the hallway. Lucas. He turned, surprised to see her. He was fully dressed, a traveling bag in his hand. Abigail, I didn't mean to wake you. You're leaving? The hurt in her voice was impossible to disguise. Just temporarily, he assured her, setting down his bag. I received information that Edward Dawson is returning to Colorado Territory on business. He'll be in Denver by the end of the week. And you're going to confront him. It wasn't a question. Lucas nodded. This may be my only chance to face him directly. The sheriff is precisely why I'm leaving tonight rather than waiting for morning. Abigail stepped closer, her heart pounding. What will you do when you find Dawson? Get a confession, if I can. Evidence of his crimes, at minimum. And if he refuses? Lucas's expression hardened. Everyone has secrets they don't want exposed. I've learned quite a bit about Edward Dawson's business practices in Boston. Be careful, she whispered. Sheriff Wilson may telegraph ahead to warn him. I know. He reached out, his fingers lightly touching her cheek. I'll return as soon as I can. The touch of his hand against her skin made Abigail's breath catch. Before she could think better of it, she rose on her tiptoes and pressed a soft kiss to his lips. For a heartbeat, Lucas stood frozen in surprise. Then his arms slipped around her waist, drawing her closer as he returned the kiss with an intensity that made her knees weak. When they finally parted, both breathless, Lucas rested his forehead against hers. I have to go. I know. Abigail stepped back reluctantly. But you have another reason to come back now. As she watched him disappear into the night, Abigail wondered if she had just made a terrible mistake or taken the first step toward healing her broken heart. 3 days after Lucas's departure, Abigail was serving breakfast to her remaining boarders when Sheriff Wilson burst through the door. Where is he, Mrs. Sullivan? He demanded. Good morning to you too, Sheriff. She replied calmly, though her heart raced. If you're looking for Mr. Irwin, he's not here. I can see that, the sheriff snapped. Where did he go? Abigail set down the coffee pot with deliberate care. Mr. Irwin is a paying boarder, not a prisoner. He doesn't report his comings and goings to me. Don't play games, Abigail. That man is causing trouble, stirring up the past. Perhaps the past needs stirring, she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. Some things shouldn't stay buried, Sheriff. Wilson's expression darkened. Like what happened at Silverton? That was an accident, a tragedy. Nothing more. Is that what you tell yourself to sleep at night? The words escaped before she could stop them. A heavy silence fell over the dining room. The other boarders exchanged uncomfortable glances. Careful, Mrs. Sullivan, the sheriff said quietly. Your husband knew when to let sleeping dogs lie. You'd be wise to follow his example. The mention of Thomas sparked something in Abigail, a righteous anger she'd suppressed for too long. My husband died carrying the weight of injustice because men like you chose convenience over truth. Sheriff Wilson's hand moved to his gun belt. I'm going to search his room. Do you have a warrant, Sheriff? Abigail asked, standing her ground. The sheriff's mouth tightened. I don't need one. I have reasonable suspicion. Of what crime exactly? Abigail pressed. Asking questions? Seeking justice for his brother? For a moment, Sheriff Wilson looked as if he might force his way past her. Then Mr. Peterson, the schoolteacher, stood up. Sheriff, I believe Mrs. Sullivan asked a fair question. What crime are you investigating that would justify searching a private citizen's room? One by one, the other boarders rose from their chairs, forming a silent wall of support behind Abigail. The sheriff looked from face to face, then back toward the door. This isn't over, Abigail. When Irwin returns, tell him I'll be waiting. After he left, Abigail's legs nearly gave out. She gripped the back of a chair to steady herself. Mrs. Holloway patted her arm. You stood up to him beautifully, dear. Thank you all, Abigail said to her boarders. I'm sorry to involve you in this. Nonsense, Mr. Peterson replied. This town has kept secrets too long. Perhaps it's time for the truth to come out. That afternoon, Abigail locked herself in her office and opened Thomas's strongbox. Inside lay a sealed envelope with her name on it in Thomas's handwriting. She'd found it after his death, but hadn't had the courage to open it. Now, with trembling fingers, she broke the seal and began to read. My dearest Abigail, Thomas had written, if you are reading this, I have passed on without finding the courage to tell you the full truth about the Silverton mine disaster. By the time she finished reading, tears streamed down Abigail's face. Thomas had known far more than he'd ever shared with her. He had evidence, real evidence, that could prove Miller and Dawson's culpability. And he had hidden it, not out of cowardice, but to protect her from the dangers that knowledge would bring. The question now was what to do with this information, and whether Lucas would return from Denver in time to use it. A week passed with no word from Lucas. Abigail tried to maintain her normal routine, but worry gnawed at her constantly. Had something happened to him in Denver? Had Dawson somehow learned he was coming? The morning stage arrived, disgorging passengers and mail. Abigail was sweeping the front porch when she noticed Sheriff Wilson engaged in an intense conversation with a well-dressed stranger. The man handed the sheriff what looked like a telegram, and Wilson's expression grew thunderous as he read it. Both men looked toward the boarding house, and Abigail quickly stepped inside, her heart pounding. Something had happened, and it wasn't good. That evening, as she was closing up for the night, a soft knock came at the back door. Cautiously, Abigail approached, a fireplace poker gripped in her hand. Who's there? She called. It's me, came Lucas's voice, strained and weak. She flung open the door to find him leaning heavily against the frame, his face bruised and a makeshift bandage wrapped around his left arm, stained with blood. My God, Lucas! She helped him inside, kicking the door shut behind them. What happened? Dawson's men. He gasped as she guided him to a kitchen chair. They were waiting for me in Denver. Abigail quickly gathered medical supplies. How badly are you hurt? Not as bad as it looks, he managed a weak smile. Mostly bruises. The arm got sliced during the fight, but it's shallow. As she cleaned his wounds, Lucas explained in halting sentences. He had tracked Dawson to a hotel in Denver, but instead of finding the businessman, he'd walked into an ambush. They took everything, my notes, the evidence I'd gathered. His voice cracked with frustration. Dawson knew I was coming. Someone warned him. Sheriff Wilson, Abigail confirmed grimly. He's been looking for you. Today he received a telegram that made him very angry. Probably news that I escaped. Lucas winced as she applied antiseptic to his arm. I managed to get away when a hotel employee interrupted the beating. Caught the first train back, then walked from the station through the woods to avoid being seen. Abigail tied off the bandage and sat beside him, taking his hand. "Lucas, I have something to show you. Something Thomas left for me." She retrieved the letter and the documents it had referenced, hidden behind a loose brick in the kitchen fireplace. As Lucas read through them, his eyes widened. "This is it," he breathed. "Proof that they deliberately weakened the support structures. Financial records showing the embezzlement. Even a witness statement from a miner who saw Dawson's foreman tampering with the supports the night before. Thomas collected it all," Abigail said quietly, "but he was afraid to use it. The witness died mysteriously a week after giving his statement. Thomas feared for my safety if he pursued it further." Lucas looked up, his expression grave. "He was right to worry. These men are dangerous, Abigail. More dangerous than I realized. What do we do now?" Before Lucas could answer, the sound of horses approaching reached them. Lucas moved to the window and peered out carefully. "Sheriff Wilson," he reported grimly. "And he's not alone. Looks like he deputized some men." Abigail's mind raced. "The cellar. You can hide there until they leave." She led him to a trapdoor in the pantry floor, revealing a small storage cellar. Lucas climbed down awkwardly, favoring his injured arm. "Abigail," he said, looking up at her from the cellar. "If anything happens—" "Nothing will happen," she interrupted fiercely. "Stay quiet. I'll handle this." She closed the trapdoor and covered it with a small rug just as pounding began at the front door. Taking a deep breath, Abigail smoothed her skirts and went to face the sheriff, praying her face wouldn't betray the fear and defiance warring within her. "Sheriff Wilson," Abigail greeted coolly when she opened the door. "This is becoming a habit." The sheriff pushed past her into the foyer, 3 grim-faced men following in his wake. "Where is he, Abigail?" "As I told you before, Mr. Irwin is not here." "Search the house," Wilson ordered his deputies. "Every room." Abigail planted herself in front of him. "Not without a warrant, Sheriff." Wilson pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. "Got one right here. Signed by Judge Parker this afternoon. Seems your boarder assaulted a prominent businessman in Denver and is wanted for questioning." Abigail's blood ran cold as she glanced at the document. It appeared legitimate. "This is absurd. Mr. Irwin is a respectable investigator. He's a troublemaker who attacked Edward Dawson in his hotel room," Wilson countered. "Dawson is pressing charges." The deputies began methodically searching the house, their heavy boots thundering on the stairs as they checked the upper floor. "This is harassment," Abigail insisted, trying to keep Wilson's attention on her and away from the kitchen. "Based on the word of a man who abandoned this town after 5 miners died under suspicious circumstances." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "You'd best watch your accusations, Mrs. Sullivan. Slander is a serious offense." "Is it slander to speak the truth?" Abigail challenged. "My husband left evidence, Sheriff. Evidence that proves the Silverton mine accident was no accident at all." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Wilson's face. "What evidence?" "Documents. Witness statements. Financial records showing embezzlement by Miller and Dawson." She took a calculated risk. "Thomas sent copies to the territorial governor before he died, to be opened in the event anything happened to me." It was a lie, but one she delivered with such conviction that doubt crept into the sheriff's expression. "She's bluffing," came a new voice from the doorway. Abigail turned to see Edward Dawson himself standing there, elegantly dressed despite the trail dust on his boots. His refined features were set in a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Sullivan, isn't it?" he said smoothly. "Your late husband was a fine accountant. Cautious man. Too cautious to have kept evidence that doesn't exist." "Mr. Sullivan changed in his final years," Abigail replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Guilt has a way of altering a person's priorities." Dawson stepped closer, his expensive cologne not quite masking the smell of cigar smoke. "If you had evidence, you would have used it by now. Perhaps I was waiting for the right moment. Or the right ally." Abigail met his gaze without flinching. "My husband may have been cautious, but I'm not." "Sheriff," called one of the deputies from upstairs. "No sign of him up here." "Check the outbuildings," Wilson ordered. "He has to be somewhere." Dawson's eyes never left Abigail's face. "You know where Irwin is. The question is, how much are you willing to suffer to protect him?" The threat hung in the air between them. Abigail's heart pounded, but she kept her expression neutral. "I don't respond well to threats, Mr. Dawson," she said quietly. Neither did Thomas. That's why he prepared for this day. A flash of uncertainty crossed Dawson's face. What exactly are you implying? Before Abigail could answer, a commotion erupted from the back of the house. A deputy appeared in the doorway, his expression triumphant. Found signs of someone coming through the back way, Sheriff. Blood on the doorframe. Dawson's smile returned. It seems Mr. Irwin is injured. How unfortunate for him. Abigail's mind raced. They would find the cellar eventually. Lucas was in no condition to run, and even if he could, where would he go? A sudden inspiration struck her. Sheriff Wilson, she said loudly, before you continue this illegal search, you should know that I've already telegraphed the territorial marshal about this matter. Wilson hesitated. What marshal? Marshal James Cooper. She improvised, naming the only federal lawman whose name she knew. He's quite interested in allegations of corruption against local officials, particularly those with family connections to mining operations. The sheriff's face paled slightly. You're bluffing. Am I? Abigail held his gaze. The stage brought a reply this morning. He's on his way from Denver now. Dawson scoffed. This is absurd. You're stalling. Perhaps, Abigail admitted. But are you willing to take that chance, Mr. Dawson? Is Sheriff Wilson? Once a federal marshal begins an investigation, it's difficult to control where it leads or what it uncovers. Uncertainty hung in the air as Wilson and Dawson exchanged glances. Abigail pressed her advantage. I propose a compromise. Leave now, both of you, and I'll ensure the marshal hears only about the mining accident, not about any irregularities in local law enforcement. Wilson's jaw clenched. You don't have the authority. No, Abigail interrupted. But I have evidence and a compelling story of corruption and murder. Which would you prefer the marshal hears first? For a long, tense moment, no one spoke. Then Dawson straightened his jacket with a sharp tug. This isn't over, Mrs. Sullivan, he said coldly. Not by a long shot. Sheriff, he snapped, turning on his heel. We're leaving. Now. Wilson hesitated, looking torn between his duty and self-preservation. Finally, he signaled to his deputies. Stand down, boys. We'll continue this tomorrow. As they filed out, Dawson paused at the door. Your husband knew when to back down, Mrs. Sullivan. You would be wise to learn from his example. My husband died with regrets, Mr. Dawson, Abigail replied softly. I don't intend to make the same mistake. After they left, Abigail sagged against the wall, trembling with delayed fear and adrenaline. She gave herself a moment to recover, then hurried to the pantry to release Lucas. When she pulled open the trapdoor, she found the cellar empty. Panic seized Abigail as she stared into the empty cellar. Lucas, she whispered desperately. No answer came from the darkness below. Heart pounding, she grabbed a lamp and descended the rough wooden steps. The small space was definitely empty, but she noticed a narrow tunnel extending from one side, an old root cellar passage she'd forgotten about. One that Thomas had mentioned led to a storm drain. Relief washed over her, followed quickly by worry. Lucas was injured and now somewhere out in the night with Dawson's men potentially searching for him. Returning upstairs, Abigail paced the kitchen, debating what to do. She couldn't search for him. That would only draw attention. But waiting felt unbearable. A soft tap at the window nearly made her scream. Lucas's face appeared briefly in the glass before disappearing again. Abigail rushed to the back door, opening it just enough to let him slip inside. I heard them searching, he explained, grimacing as he favored his injured arm. Couldn't risk them finding me here. It would only put you in more danger. Where did you go? She asked, helping him to a chair. The tunnel led to a drainage pipe near the creek. I circled back through the woods to watch the house. His eyes held a mixture of admiration and concern. You were magnificent, Abigail, but also reckless. Dawson is a dangerous man. I know. She checked his bandage, which had begun bleeding again. But he's also a cautious one. The bluff about the marshal gave us some time, but not much. We need to get the evidence to the territorial authorities, Lucas said grimly. Tonight, if possible. Abigail shook her head. The stage doesn't leave until morning, and they'll be watching it. Besides, you're in no condition to travel. Then we need allies. Lucas leaned forward, wincing with the movement. People in town who can help us stand against Dawson and Wilson. Abigail considered this. There are some who lost family in the mine disaster, others who were ruined when the mine closed and the company declared bankruptcy. They might help, but they're afraid, Lucas finished. With good reason. They sat in silence, the ticking of the kitchen clock marking the passing minutes as they considered their options. Finally, Abigail straightened. Mr. Peterson, the schoolteacher who boards here. His brother died in the accident. And Mr. Jenkins at the telegraph office lost his savings when the mining company collapsed. They might help. Good, Lucas nodded. Who else? By midnight, they had a list of potential allies and a desperate plan. While Lucas rested, Abigail wrote a series of carefully worded notes, which she would deliver at first light. As she worked, she could feel the weight of what they were attempting. Standing against the sheriff and a powerful businessman like Dawson was dangerous, perhaps even foolhardy. But the alternative, letting the truth remain buried, allowing Lucas to be arrested or worse, was unthinkable. When she finished the last note, Abigail found Lucas dozing in the chair, his face drawn with pain even in sleep. Gently, she covered him with a blanket, allowing herself a moment to study his face. In the weeks since he had arrived at her boarding house, this man had somehow become essential to her. The thought of losing him now, just as she was beginning to feel alive again, was unbearable. We'll get through this, she whispered, though whether to reassure him or herself, she wasn't certain. As if hearing her, Lucas's eyes opened. He caught her hand in his. Abigail, he said softly. If this goes badly tomorrow, she pressed her fingers against his lips. It won't. He kissed her fingertips, then gently pulled her hand away. If it does, he continued, I want you to know that finding my brother brought me to Cottonwood Springs, but you're the reason I wanted to stay. Abigail's heart swelled with emotions she had thought permanently buried with Thomas. Then stay, she whispered. When this is over, stay with me. His answer was to draw her down into a kiss that promised everything words could not. Outside, the night deepened toward dawn, and with it, their resolve to finally bring justice to Cottonwood Springs, or die trying. Dawn broke over Cottonwood Springs with an eerie calm. Abigail moved through the house quietly, preparing breakfast for her boarders as if it were any ordinary day. Only she and Lucas knew what the morning might bring. After the other boarders left for their daily activities, Lucas emerged from the cellar where he'd hidden during breakfast. His color was better, though his movements were still stiff from his injuries. Did you deliver the messages? He asked. Abigail nodded. While fetching the morning milk. Now we wait to see who responds. The answer came sooner than expected. Just after 9 o'clock, Mr. Peterson returned to the boarding house, accompanied by 3 other men. Mr. Jenkins from the telegraph office, elderly Mr. Simmons who had lost his son in the mine disaster, and to Abigail's surprise, Reverend Clark from the church. Mrs. Sullivan, the Reverend greeted her solemnly. Mr. Peterson says you have evidence about what really happened at the Silverton mine. I do, Reverend, she confirmed, leading them into the parlor where Lucas waited. But before I show you, you should understand the risk. Sheriff Wilson and Edward Dawson will not surrender their secrets willingly. The old miner, Simmons, spat into the fireplace. They took my boy. What more can they take from me? Mr. Jenkins nodded grimly. They took my savings, my future. I've been afraid to speak up for 3 years, but I'm not alone anymore. The Lord abhors injustice and those who pervert truth for gain, Reverend Clark said quietly. I've suspected for years that there was more to the accident than we were told. One by one, they committed themselves to the cause. As Lucas laid out Thomas's evidence on the dining table, Abigail felt hope rising for the first time. Perhaps they could succeed after all. Their planning was interrupted by the sound of horses outside. Peering through the curtains, Abigail saw Sheriff Wilson dismounting in front of the boarding house, accompanied by Dawson and several rough-looking men. They're here, she said, turning to the others. Earlier than I expected. Lucas quickly gathered the documents. Mr. Jenkins, can you still get these to the territorial governor in Denver? The telegraph operator nodded, tucking the papers into his jacket. There's a back way through the alley. I can reach the stage office without being seen. Go now, Lucas urged. The rest of us will delay them. As Jenkins slipped out the back door, a pounding began at the front. Abigail took a deep breath and went to answer, the others arraying themselves behind her in a show of solidarity. She opened the door to find Sheriff Wilson, his hand raised to knock again. His expression darkened when he saw the group assembled behind her. Mrs. Sullivan, he said tightly, I believe we have unfinished business. Do we, Sheriff? She replied calmly. I wasn't aware of any official matters requiring my attention. Dawson pushed forward, his composure cracking slightly. "Where is Irwin? And where are the documents you claim to have?" "Mr. Irwin is here," Lucas said, stepping forward. "And as for the documents, they're already on their way to the territorial governor's office." Dawson's face contorted with fury. "You're bluffing. The stage hasn't left yet." "Who said anything about the stage?" Lucas smiled coldly. "Technology is a wonderful thing, Mr. Dawson. The telegraph can transmit information much faster than a horse." It was a bluff. The documents needed to be physically delivered, but the uncertainty on Dawson's face suggested it had hit its mark. "Sheriff," Dawson snapped, "arrest this man for assault and theft of private documents." Wilson hesitated, looking at the group of respected townspeople standing with Abigail and Lucas. "Mr. Dawson, perhaps we should discuss this now, Sheriff." Dawson's voice rose to a near shout. "Or shall I inform your superiors about our financial arrangements over the years?" The threat hung in the air, confirming the corruption that many had suspected. Several townspeople had gathered on the street, drawn by the commotion, and now they murmured among themselves at this revelation. "Edward Dawson," came a new voice from the edge of the crowd. The town undertaker, Mr. Collins, stepped forward. "I've waited 3 years to say this to your face. You murdered those men as surely as if you'd put a gun to their heads." "That's slander," Dawson sputtered. "Sheriff, arrest him too." But Wilson was looking increasingly uncertain as more townspeople joined the group, their faces showing a mixture of anger and long-suppressed grief. "I exhumed those bodies," Collins continued, his voice carrying across the now-silent street. "Saw the injuries that didn't match a simple cave-in. Said nothing because I was afraid. Not anymore." One by one, others stepped forward with their own testimonies. A former mine clerk described altered safety reports. A widow recalled how her husband had complained about weakened supports just days before the disaster. As the chorus of accusations grew, Sheriff Wilson looked increasingly uncomfortable. Dawson's face had gone from red with anger to pale with fear. "This is ridiculous," Dawson said, but his voice had lost its authority. "These people have no proof, but we do," Abigail interrupted. "Thomas kept everything, Mr. Dawson. Every falsified report, every doctored ledger. He carried the guilt of his silence to his grave, but he left the truth for those brave enough to speak it." Dawson's eyes darted around like a cornered animal's. Suddenly, he reached inside his jacket and pulled out a revolver, pointing it directly at Abigail. "Enough," he shouted. "I built something from nothing. I won't let a widow and a vengeful brother destroy everything I've worked for." Time seemed to slow as several things happened at once. Sheriff Wilson reached for his own gun, shouting at Dawson to stand down. Lucas lunged toward Abigail, trying to shield her. And from the edge of the crowd, a shot rang out. Dawson staggered, a look of shock on his face as a red stain spread across his expensive jacket. He crumpled to his knees, the unfired gun falling from his grasp. Through the parting crowd walked Mr. Simmons, the old miner, an ancient rifle still smoking in his gnarled hands. "That was for my boy," he said simply. Chaos erupted as Sheriff Wilson finally moved to restore order, deputies rushing to disarm Simmons and attend to Dawson, who lay moaning on the ground, his wound painful but not immediately fatal. In the confusion, Lucas pulled Abigail back into the boarding house, closing the door behind them. "Are you all right?" he asked, his hands gentle on her shoulders. She nodded, though she was trembling. "Yes, but Mr. Simmons will likely face charges," Lucas finished grimly. "But he's not alone anymore. None of us are." Through the window, they watched as more townspeople arrived, their voices rising in a demand for justice long denied. Sheriff Wilson, overwhelmed by the turning tide and his own exposed corruption, was clearly losing control of the situation. "What happens now?" Abigail asked softly. Lucas took her hand, his eyes never leaving hers. "Justice, finally. For Daniel, for Thomas, for everyone who suffered because of Dawson and Miller's greed. And after that," she pressed, suddenly needing to know. His expression softened. "After that, if you'll have me, I'd like to stay. This boarding house could use a permanent guest, I think." Abigail's heart swelled with an emotion she had thought lost forever. "I think that could be arranged," she whispered, leaning into his embrace as outside. The town of Cottonwood Springs began the long process of healing. Autumn 1873 golden leaves drifted past the windows of the Sullivan boarding house as Abigail placed a vase of late-blooming wildflowers on the dining table. The house was quieter now with just two regular boarders, Mr. Peterson, who had become the school principal, and Mrs. Holloway, who had decided to make Cottonwood Springs her permanent home after her daughter married a local rancher. The past year had brought dramatic changes to the town. Edward Dawson had survived his wound only to face trial for fraud and criminal negligence resulting in death. Currently serving a 10-year sentence, his fall had exposed corruption throughout the territory, leading to Sheriff Wilson's removal from office and a series of reforms in mining regulations. Old Mr. Simmons had faced his own trial for shooting Dawson, but with the entire town testifying to the circumstances and the jury's sympathy, he had received only a nominal sentence of 6 months, most of which the new sheriff allowed him to serve by helping at the church. Most significantly for Abigail, the empty room at the end of the hall, the one overlooking the garden, was empty no more. Its occupant had indeed become the one guest who never left, though he was no longer just a guest. The back door opened, and Lucas entered, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. His face brightened at the sight of her. "Something smells wonderful," he said, crossing the kitchen to kiss her. "Apple pie," she replied. Mrs. Peterson brought apples from their orchard. Lucas smiled, his arms still around her waist. "Have I told you today how happy you make me, Mrs. Irwin?" The name still sent a pleasant thrill through Abigail, even after 6 months of marriage. "You might have mentioned it this morning," she teased. "But I don't mind hearing it again." Their wedding in the spring had been a quiet affair, attended by the townspeople who had stood with them during those dangerous days the year before. Reverend Clark had officiated, his sermon touching on renewal and second chances. They had considered leaving Cottonwood Springs, perhaps returning to Boston where Lucas had family, but in the end, the boarding house had become more than just a business to Abigail. It was where she had found herself again after Thomas's death, where she had discovered courage she didn't know she possessed, and where she had found love when she least expected it. Lucas had settled into life in the small town with surprising ease, using his investigative skills to help the new sheriff occasionally and investing his inheritance in local businesses still recovering from the mining company's collapse. "I visited Daniel's grave today," he said, his expression growing thoughtful. "Left some of those late sunflowers you cut yesterday." Abigail squeezed his hand. The proper headstones Lucas had commissioned for all 5 miners had been installed in the spring, each bearing a name. Daniel's and the other 4 who had been identified through Lucas's persistent research. No longer unmarked, no longer forgotten. "Thomas would be pleased," she said softly. Justice was all he wanted in the end. "Justice and your happiness," Lucas corrected gently. "I think he'd be pleased about that too." Abigail nodded, thinking of the letter she kept in her jewelry box, the one in which Thomas had written of his hopes that she would find joy again someday. In a way, his final act of preserving the evidence had led directly to her current happiness. "I have news," she said, changing the subject as she returned to her pie preparations. "Mrs. Holloway's niece has written asking if we have room. She's coming west to teach at the school." Lucas leaned against the counter, watching her work. "So the boarding house continues." "It seems so," Abigail agreed with a smile, "though not quite as I expected when I first opened it." "No regrets?" he asked, a teasing light in his eyes. Abigail set down her rolling pin and turned to face him fully, her heart overflowing with contentment. "Not a single one. Though I do have one complaint about that sign I hung." "Oh." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "Sullivan Boarding House," she quoted. "I should have it repainted to Irwin Boarding House." Lucas shook his head, pulling her close again. "Keep it as it is. It's how I found you, after all." As the autumn light slanted through the windows and the scent of apples and cinnamon filled the kitchen, Abigail realized that what had begun as a desperate measure to survive widowhood had become the foundation of a new life she could never have imagined. The lonely widow had opened her boarding house to the world, and in doing so, had opened her heart to the one guest who would never leave. And she wouldn't have it any other way.